Well, I think we're ready to get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, welcome to our first webinar entitled Combating Fraud in the Retail Energy Industry, hosted by the Retail Energy Market Fraud Coalition. So we'll just go ahead and get started. Before we jump into our presentation, I need to take care of some housekeeping matters. The first matter of business is to read our antitrust disclosure statement. The REM Fraud Coalition strictly prohibits retail energy participants and their employees, agents, or vendors who are participating in the REM Fraud Coalition activities from using their participation in the coalition activities as a forum for engaging in practices or communications that violate the antitrust laws. The REM Fraud Coalition has approved guidelines for members of the coalition's committees and working groups to be reviewed and followed by each participant attending Fraud Coalition meetings. A copy of the guidelines was provided when you registered for the webinar. If you would like a copy of these guidelines, copies are available on EarthEtch's website. It is the policy and expectation that all persons participating in the REM Fraud Coalition activities, including meetings, webinars, conference calls, email communications, and informal discussions, to comply with the antitrust laws. Antitrust laws are intended to promote competition in markets, and violations of the laws can result in severe criminal penalties and civil liabilities for individuals and their companies. There are a couple more housekeeping items I would like to address before we get started. First, the webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar will be made available on our website for those who could not attend this kickoff session. Today's presentation is expected to last around 45 minutes, hopefully leaving room for some follow-up questions. I also wanted to note that there is an opportunity to submit questions that we will try and address if time permits. If we don't have time to get all of your questions answered, don't worry. We plan on hosting future webinars on the topic of fraud where we can elaborate on topical questions. I do want to let you know that we are incredibly pleased to see the number of participants that have signed up and have already signed on. So obviously, this is an important topic to several folks. So now I think I'll turn it over to Kelly to introduce us to the agenda.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. I looked at the attendee list, and it looks like I know quite a few of you on the call. I guess the things we hope to address today, why we're here. We have some people on the speaker panel that are going to address who's affected by fraud, the types of fraud that we're experiencing out there, the magnitude of the fraud, how consumers are affected, and I think most importantly, examples of fraud prevention and some best practices and ways to just simply identify fraud as best you can. Next slide. I'm just going to start this off with a quote from Daryl Lawrence, who is the co-founder and CMO of Good Charlie. The energy sector is grappling with a significant issue, an increase in fraudulent enrollments, many of which appear to be linked to organized crime. As an industry, we must confront this aggressively and collectively. Implementing robust security measures and enhancing collaboration with law enforcement are essential steps. We must address this issue head on to protect our customers and maintain the integrity of our services. I think all of the folks on this panel have heard from countless people that fraud is an issue. I think what really brought this close to home is we all attended a conference back in March, and it really was the hot topic, and just realized how rampant it really is, and what a devastating impact it's having on consumers and the retail energy market in general. And we know there are a lot of efforts being attempted to address this, and we felt like kind of gathering everyone together, working together, we would be able to achieve a much more effective and efficient outcome to this problem. And so we decided to kickstart a series of webinars. And, this is the first one. We're hopeful to have many more, and hopeful that we can pool our resources and identify and stop fraud on a broader scale than we could just acting on our own. So I think Daryl did a great job of summarizing the issue. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Madeline.
Thank you, Kelly. I think now we'll go on to introducing our speakers on the next slide. So first of all, my name is Madeline Kachera, and I am the founder and CEO of EarthEdge. EarthEdge helps retail energy companies navigate the regulatory compliance complexities and the utility operational maze. Next, we have Holly Paulus, founder and CEO of Nexa Group. Nexa Group focuses on data-driven strategies for retail energy marketing, compliance best practices, as well as solutions aimed at fraud prevention. Terry McDaniel is the president and at TPV Solution. Terry comes with a strong IT background in the retail energy and telecom industry. Terry's company finds ways to streamline business solutions to fit the mission of the company and allows agility within the organization while seeking to mitigate risk with a laser-focused eye on fraud prevention. Continuing on the next slide with speaker introductions, we have Dan Sullivan, who is president and CEO at EIQ Digital. Dan's company, EIQ Digital, provides AI-driven digital technology that supports energy firms' digital transformation and the economy's transition to a sustainable energy future. Finally, and certainly not last, I'd like to introduce you to Kelly Balch. Kelly is a principal at Regulatory Compliance Services, or RCS. Like our other speakers today, Kelly is no stranger to the competitive retail energy industry. Kelly has held numerous marketing and regulatory compliance roles, helping companies mitigate potential regulatory compliance risks and improve operations. Okay, now we just want to begin by setting the stage of what our speakers will be addressing. In a nutshell, we are all affected by fraud. Consumers, companies, regulatory and consumer agencies. Fraud is particularly harmful to consumers in several ways, but especially if fraud is the result of identity theft. Suppliers, brokers, and the vendors are clearly harmed by all the clawback compensation. Moreover, the financial loss from fraud can be substantial. The suppliers are subjected to increased complaints that ultimately can damage their reputation. Moreover, regulatory and consumer groups spend time and resources investigating claims of fraud that may ultimately result in regulatory action, which accompanies fines and penalties. We've seen purchase of receivable rates on the rise, in part due to increased fraudulent enrollments. And we must ask ourselves if existing laws and rules allow us to timely respond to the growing threat and consequences of fraudulent enrollments. Now we'll move on to Dan, and what do we mean by fraud?
Okay, thank you, Madeline. So what do we mean by fraud? There are many varieties. There are the traditional forms like identity theft using stolen credit cards. There are outbound call centers offering free electricity or posing as the utility. There are door-to-door agents making bogus claims or gaming their TPVs. But the fraudsters are getting way more sophisticated. There is growing use of AI and digital technology to probe supplier and broker websites for vulnerabilities. There are organized seminars teaching, quote, fraud agents and fraud prospects how to commit fraud. Fraudsters are using mass marketing techniques like Craigslist, social media, neighborhood signage to bring in way more prospects to use their services. I could go on, but the moral of the story is that fraud is very big business and it's here to stay. It's going to be a long-term issue for our industry. We realize that when we find solutions, the fraudsters are already developing new methods to cheat and deceive. That's why it's our goal to bring together the best minds in our industry to combat all forms of fraud in our attempt to stay one step ahead of the fraudsters.
Thanks, Dan. But before maybe we go on to that one, Tony, if we could go back to the prior slide. We did receive a question regarding organized crime. Would you mind taking this one specifically? What do we mean when we use the term organized crime?
That's a great question, Madeline. I mean, I get that. I've gotten that question about organized crimes, whether it's the traditional sense of organized crime or not. What's very true is it's becoming much more sophisticated. So the impact of a person or a small group of people can really have the full impact of what we traditionally thought as organized crime. There's a lot of sense that there are very, very organized groups out there, but what that mix is, we don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thanks,
Okay,
Dan.
great.
Tony, we can go on to the next slide now.
So I'll jump in here, and I wanted to share with everyone the magnitude of fraud. It's much broader than most people that I chat with conceptualize. The fraud reaches across the economy. There's really not any type of company or consumer who is immune to the impacts of fraud. In 2023, the FTC has reported over 10 billion in fraud losses. That's substantial. Both consumers and businesses are impacted. In Texas, there's a lot of bad debt from fraud accounts, more than 150 million in losses. We know from studies that new account enrollment fraud averages 20 to 30%. That has a huge impact on the business's bottom line. But Texas is not alone, and that's the message we want to get across today. Pennsylvania, for an example, reported 57.4 million in losses due to fraud. 33% of that fraud was due to imposter scams, which is also considered identity theft. So one of the things that I wanted to chat a little bit about on this magnitude is some real world examples. One of the most recent things that were identified is that we have uncovered backdoor sales channels of leads that belong to other reps that are being used to then convert new enrollments for a different rep, which leads to, and this was uncovered in vendor audits, and this leads to a high % of churn, all happening within 90 days. That, of course, impacts not only the consumer, but also the bottom line for the business. A couple other real life examples that I wanted to share with you, and some on the call may be familiar with or not, and that is there are Facebook schemes with ghost agents enrolling consumers, unbeknownst to the consumer, with a rep. They're taking payment through Facebook ads and push pay apps, and so the retail energy provider never sees that money. The other one is a door-to-door, again, another push pay for free electricity scheme. So these are just examples of what's out in the marketplace, which is damaging both to the consumer, the perception of the brand reputation, and then the business's bottom line. So to get a bigger glimpse here, I wanted to share with you some stats, and you can just see the national coverage. This was a report done by the FTC Consumer Sentinel Network for 2023. This is as of December 31st, and you can see it's pretty expansive. And I think the key here is this is the number reported. So there's a lot of fraud that goes unreported because it takes time. It takes time to go and log it and report it and figure out who you need to report it to. And so these numbers are pretty staggering. Tony, if you can move to the next slide. And then I wanted to take a closer look just at the fraud on identity theft fraud in New Jersey. Even this is staggering. This is one state, much like we just talked about for Pennsylvania, with $63.4 million in loss due to fraud. And again, imposter scams are at the top of the list. The losses are just staggering at the state level. You can go to the next slide. Consumers are affected in multiple ways. Naturally, consumers want to trust their electricity and their energy provider to keep the lights on. What's happening though with fraud is it's derailing consumer trust at a different level. They lack a trust because they don't understand how their information was used to enroll. It increases consumer complaints against the brand. And it also, the consumers are trying to figure out who allowed for their personal information to be used because they didn't authorize it. So this begins to stack up and derail that consumer trust against the brand. Fraud was the #1 reported category by the FTC in 2023 with over 5.4 million reports. Again, that's what was reported. You can imagine it was probably much higher. Of those reports, 48% of that number was fraud. I'm going to jump to the next slide. And this is just a snapshot. I think the point here is that no one is really immune from the impacts of fraud. Young, old, it doesn't matter. Everyone can be subjected to fraud at different levels. And again, the top 3 categories and the top 2 that I see over and over again when I look at each of the states is identity theft and imposter scams. And even the government. I thought this particular clip was interesting. No one's immune. Even the government has had an 82% increase in identity theft reported for applying for benefits and those benefits received. That's staggering. So the bottom line is that combating fraud must be a priority if we're going to be effective as change leaders in this industry. This is why we're all here today. Next, Terry's going to be sharing with us a few best practices to thwart the bad actors and help reduce and prevent fraud.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So, I think that Holly and Dan have really framed fraud in our industry. I think I would be surprised if there's anyone on this call that has not been touched by this or had experience with this. Adam Kane from Power Target kind of poses the question, what does the industry need, right? So we know this is an issue. We're getting hit from regulatory on a constant basis. I think some have shown what I would say is losing trust that we can kind of get our hands on this. So and Adam goes on to say, look, a central or industry standard view on what's causing this fraud, and then some safeguards that we can all agree to use. That may go as far as legislation, with significant penalties, right? If there's no penalization, if there's no one's held accountable, then this kind of thing can move on. But before we can hold that accountable, we have to figure out how can we identify it and prevent it on our side. And so that's what I'll talk to next. So on the next slide, I think fraud prevention really starts at the first point of contact with the customer, and that's going to be with your sales team. This is going to be vendor management. If you have a system or at least a process by which you onboard vendors, verify backgrounds, verify who it is that's selling for you. There was an old thing that we used to do where you would have a vendor channel that everybody used the same login, so you could never really identify who it was that did any one thing without listening to hundreds and hundreds of calls to try to identify that one agent that may be the bad agent or 2 agents. But having that process in place and utilizing it correctly, staying up with it. And then moving on from that, just utilizing technology in general, there is still a lot of manual validations and manual checks that are being implemented. And this is 2024. We kind of have an IT thing going on now that allows us to watch for that. The industry and people who are committing fraud and are moving on to AI, and we're still in spreadsheets trying to catch these things. There's a criticalness of having real-time information. Having a person or an army of people trying to scan through calls and data points is not a good use of anybody's time. Plus, it puts you behind. You're already at a disadvantage when trying to find this stuff. Some of the quick safeguards, easy stuff, right? And enrollment entry point integrations. So when customers are coming in, that should, again, if you can get away from spreadsheets, are you doing your entry point checks? When the customer's coming in, have we ever seen this customer before? Are we seeing, similar pieces of information, the same phone number over and over and over, the same email address over and over? Having pre-checks at the verification process. Dan mentioned around gaming the third-party verification. Are there checks there, or do the checks happen after the fact? The further upstream you can check, the more likely you are to catch things. And then having the post checks, the traditional things that we're used to. Is there a team looking at information in the real time, say, okay, here's what we're seeing. Does this pass muster? Is there anything that's throwing some red flags out to us as we're going? And then the last thing really is, you cannot set this and forget it. As soon as you set and you get comfortable with it, then the fraudster is going to find ways to get around that, right? To Dan's point, they have seminars of their own where they teach, okay, here's the new flavor. Here's what we got to do to get around it. I'll give a perfect example. We used to do the location settings, right? We could tell where an agent was at any given time door to door. We can tell where the customer is. And then agents go in, and now they're spoofing technology where they can actually make it look like they're somewhere that they are not. And so then we have to go even further with that and say, okay, how can we get around the thing that gets around us, right? And so it's a constant game of chess that we have to be playing. So we move on to the next slide. So with your third-party partners, this is whether it's your third-party verification, there is email and phone fraud prevention APIs that you can integrate with. I would say that there's no one-stop shop for any of this. If there was, then there would only be one person on this call giving this seminar, I think, or this webinar. I think that this is if I get anything across to everyone, this is a rising water lifts all ships situation. If we try to make fraud detection and fraud prevention a differentiator, then we will lose our industry. Just plain and simple. And there's people that I know in this industry have been here a long time would wholeheartedly agree with what I'm saying. There are identity verifications. You have the old school credit bureaus that they all through APIs now where they can just verify, is this person even real? And then you have the sync list, right? If Joe Smith is being enrolled at 123 Test Street, and you go check the sync list, and Joe Smith doesn't live at 123 Test Street, that's Jane Doe. Okay, well, that might be a problem. Did somebody move recently? And that's again all these little red flags. And then the other thing to Holly's point is that we know reported fraud, but when it goes unreported, it's very difficult for us to get a handle on how big is this, right? And reporting the fraud, to the FTC here, we've got the link with details. What is the fraud? Because I can't prevent something that I don't know what's happening. You're making me go in and try to figure out, or an IT professional try to figure out, okay, how can we get around this? But I don't even know what it is yet. So I think the reporting is going to be critical as well. And so let's talk a little bit more about identifying this. So again, real time is critical. The insights in your reporting from whatever vendor that you're utilizing need to be, if I have to build a report for you, if I'm an IT guy in your organization and I have to build a report for you and then bring in all of the data from the day before, clean all of that data, get it into a BI tool, and then drop it into the BI tool for you to see it, you're going to get it at noon the next day. You're already a day and a half late on that. Marketing hates you because they don't know how well their products are selling. Your IT resources are being taken up, and sales doesn't like it because they're trying to get enrollments out. They're trying to get paid for that. operations doesn't like it, they're trying to get enrollments in. So all of that in real time is critical. And I know it seems impossible, but it's really not. This is pretty basic functionality to get into real time now. And then I tell people this a lot when I was doing like cybersecurity fraud stuff. Process, process. Your processes and procedures are going to be what keep things from happening that should not happen. This goes from finance all the way through to this. If you bypass some of your steps to hurry things along, you're going to miss something. So building a process by which, number one, that you identify the fraud, but then that somebody is monitoring these flags that pop up from day to day. And then the third thing is a process around how do we address changes to the process should fraud change its face, right? And so you can't just sit in, okay, well, it worked yesterday, so it's going to work today. Eventually it will not. And then we can go on to auditing. I mean, you should be auditing your vendor list, whoever is selling for you on a constant basis. Again, in real time, you want to be able to turn people on and off that are selling. If it's a 24 to 48 hour process to remove an agent from selling in your platform, then you have 24 to 48 hours worth of risk that you have to assess when you find something that's wrong. Monitoring your performance of your agents. Now, we can always spot an agent that's doing poorly, but be very careful when an agent suddenly becomes your star performer. Maybe it's legit. Maybe they turned over a new leaf in the last week and suddenly they're tripling their book size, or maybe they're not. And so again, things that may turn out to be false positives, you still need to at least address the positive to see if there's something going on there. So think about what some of the examples that I've seen. We've talked a little bit about it, but we talk about like churn, which I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that I'm seeing is like you get a couple agents that work together to sell each other the customer contracts, right? So one sits there and enrolls it, the other one finishes the signatures, the e-signs, and the TPPs. And maybe they use a few spoofing. It's easy if a group of people do this. And this kind of goes back to the original question around organized crime. If two or more people are working together, that is organized. Now, it's not the traditional like mafia type organized that we think about, but it is running down that path of, hey, we've got people that I've seen the text messages, I've seen the emails where all the way at the top of this vendor, they're explaining to their sales agents how to do these things. And so, if you're not looking at like, where are these people positioned at? Like, where is their location? Are they using the same information over and over? When you listen to a call, is it the same voice answering the questions over and over and over, right? Things like that you've got to pay attention to, and then watching for like customer cancellation. So we always look at things that have passed muster, right? So they go through the third-party verification, everything that's good, we QC it, we approve it, and we say, okay, well, they have maybe a 5 or 10% failure rate. Well, let's go look at those failures. Why are they failing? Where are they dropping out in the process? And then tie them in with cancellations. Where are the customers canceling along the process? When they get enrolled and they see their first bill, are they canceling? Why are they canceling? And you can look at PUC complaints and find this stuff. But that will kind of give you some insight into where some of these vectors may be coming. And then we talked about location tracking. I think it's critical to use. You do have to be smart with it to make sure that you can stay ahead of people that are, like I said, using spoof programs in order to change their location. There are ways around that. It's not easy, but there are ways around people using that. So let's talk a little bit about churn on the next slide.
And maybe if we could just go back real quick, hate to interrupt Terry, but got some questions about just monitoring and auditing. Are you suggesting and recommending that the supplier itself does the monitoring and auditing? We have a lot of companies say, gee, I just paid a lot of money to a vendor to do all of this, and why shouldn't they be monitoring and auditing this?
Yeah, so if you're relying on the vendor to self-check, that could be problematic, right? Because especially if it's a vendor this is ingrained into the culture of the vendor. But I would say if you're using an external auditor, if you have a QC team, somebody that's keeping an eye on these, a lot of your vendors will have reports. They'll kind of monitor their own stuff. They'll give you information, but it's always good to go back and just that trust but verify, right? Just check it. Just make sure that it makes sense. And then there's some things that that you can do on your side, in these processes to kind of have some what I would call like shadow verifications. Is I'm going to be checking things that may not be telling my vendors that I'm checking. That way, if they are doing something, they won't know that I'm looking at this. It shouldn't become, to your point, Madeline, that the cost of this, if it's costing so much money for you to monitor your vendor, then maybe your data is not coming as easy as it should. Maybe work with that vendor to figure out, hey, I need a better monitoring option, something that I can quickly identify trends, track progress, things like that. So,
Okay.
I'll give you
And
an
I got,
example. For instance,
okay.
if I have a vendor management system internally and I have a vendor that's keeping track of all of my agents, well, then that vendor onboards a new agent. They may not know that that agent was blacklisted from me with another vendor. They were working for another vendor. They did something they weren't supposed to do. So I offboarded them from that. They went next door to work with another vendor. That vendor may or may not know that that agent worked for me before, and I don't want that agent working with me. So you have to tell your vendor, like your vendor's not going to know that information. You would have to tell them that.
Okay, great. I also got just a follow-up question, just somewhat unrelated, but could you, the term sync list has been used, and a couple of folks just interested, not sure, familiar with it, and if you could elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, some utility. So there's a couple different sync lists I'm talking about here. So there are utility sync lists where customers who have not opted out, like up in the PJM area, Northeast, they will have a utility sync list. There's also, like in Texas, you can get in and get to some of the Texas information. It shows you ESID. Will show you some information like number of times a customer has switched. They may not tell you who they're with, but they'll tell you how many times they've switched in the last, say, 60 days. Things like that you can monitor. And other folks on here can talk even more to that. Dan and Holly, they were familiar with these as well. I also talked through, if there is known fraud lists, there are actually some that are for sale that you can monitor. There's some companies that you can integrate with that won't present the list to you, but you can ping against that list, and Holly can kind of give some information on what those look like that we utilize as well. So I hope that answers the question. We can get deep into that, and I can go through all of the lists, but yeah, there's a couple different options there.
That was helpful. Thanks.
Okay. And so then let me finish up with churn. So churn, traditionally, what I've seen churn is you're looking month over month, and you may look into the future and kind of look at long-term churn of the book, but you're not looking at it at a low enough level to identify fraud. So here's what I mean. You have a sales team that sells, they have a clawback period of, say, I don't know, 90 days, 90 days if you're good, maybe 30 days, 60 days. So you look at churn of the book month over month, but you're not looking at the churn of that agent. And so if you start seeing that a specific vendor is flat over the long term, so say every 3 months you look at it and you see that they actually have flat sales, meaning most of the book churns off after 90 days. And so their sales is flat. It may look great for 30 days and then it trickles down and then it pops back up and it trickles down. What you're probably seeing there, or a good possibility you're seeing they're turning the book over. They're effectively selling it to somebody else and then coming and bringing it back to you. I have seen this, unfortunately, but you need to have that information again in real time. You want to see it. You want to know what those are, but you need it at the granular level, at the agent level. Okay, is the agent acting alone, or do we have a larger issue with this, right? It's very easy to look at performance, week over week, month over month, but when you start looking at it longer periods of time, you're going to start seeing the churn shows flat on the sales cycle. So just some things to be watching for. Looking for patterns, look at things by agent, by vendor, and then look at patterns within the markets and the zip codes. I think everybody, again, most people on this call have probably dealt with this where, or at least heard about it, where whole books are getting, kind of remarketed to, you go with a third party call center, and then they're repackaging your book and selling it after the clawback period. And then I would say the last thing I'll leave with this is that are the sales too good to be true? Again, back to the individual agent. If all of a sudden you haven't changed anything in your marketing, you haven't offered any new promotions, Nothing is different. You didn't just undercut, everybody else in the market with your rate, and suddenly your book is growing at, unheard of speed. Something might be up. At least investigate it. Maybe it worked. Maybe you hit the jackpot and customers love you and they want to be your customer. Maybe you did, but maybe you didn't. Because the problem is that if you didn't, the cost to find out later is astronomical, right? You've hedged your book, you've got all these customers onboarded, you've paid your salespeople, and now these customers are going to drop. At the least, they're going to drop and leave and just not say anything. At the worst, you're going to get PUC complaints, and you're going to have fines. You're going to have to, pay back customers. I mean, there's all kinds of bad stuff that can happen there. So, again, at the end of the day, this is a rising water lifts all ships kind of situation. We need to be diligent in this, or we're going to have problems. So we already have problems, but it's going to get worse. So I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, and I guess maybe before we go to this, I had a couple more questions, and I'll turn it over to Holly or Dan or, Terry. One question that came up and that I know companies ask all the time, we talk about onboarding and vendor onboarding, and how does a company know? I mean, wouldn't it be great if you just had a list and here's 10 companies that have recently gotten in trouble, vendors, and then you say, okay, good, I don't, might not want to use that. But short of that, how do companies really effectively onboard a vendor? And I'll open it up to any of you.
I think I can jump in on a couple high level points. I call it credentialing and vetting. And with that comes a bit of time involved. And a lot of people jump in with a lot of vendors because they're in a hurry. They need to get the sales moving, etc. It's worth the time spent to do the background research, to do the credit checks, to verify there hasn't been prior litigation for that company. Their name hasn't changed in the past 12 months or every past 12 months for the past 5 years, as an example. That's real scenario. And really checking, are they onshore? Do they have a physical address here in the States? If you're going to qualify and credential someone who, for example, is a call center that's offshore, can you verify the identity of the individuals who own the company? So there's a lot that goes with that. And that's just one example, but those are some of the things that even I use for vendors that we credential.
Yeah, Holly makes a great point. So I'm a process guy, right? So I would say all of what Holly said should be part of your vendor management process. This isn't just agents that are selling for you, but all vendors that you are looking to work with. This is everything from your CIS system to your third-party verification to your sales agents. Any system that you utilize internally that is run by a vendor in some part or at whole should be run through a vendor management process where you do all of the background check, you do all of the interviews, you check references, all of that information. So if you don't have a process, it makes it very chaotic every time you need to onboard a vendor. If you have a process, then you're ready. All the paperwork's ready to go. You just go check the boxes.
Dan, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. On the digital side, one thing you can do is make sure you're looking at what the patterns are of folks who are coming to enroll into your website. Some of the situations we've seen with fraudulent folks coming in, they follow specific patterns that are not typically normal for a usual shopper. So if you see people clicking from one button to the next very quickly, going out of order in terms of putting information in, you should be monitoring that and identifying those patterns as possible fraudulent enrollments and set up systems to help detect that so that they get checked before they go too far.
Okay. And I just received another question. What about what would be the best approach when you suspect a broker platform has been compromised and customer data has been poached?
Well, so I'll tell you from a cybersecurity situation, you should immediately reach out to legal counsel and they will guide you on that process because there is very specific determination whether you have to notify. And so, I mean, that in and of itself could be its own webinar, but I can tell you contact legal because you need attorney-client privilege. Like there's so many things. So yeah, and then they will walk you through that process of, okay, is this considered a true breach? Is this, was customer information pulled off of here? What's at stake? Was it personal information? Was it more than just name? Was it like public PII or was it private? But yeah, I could talk about that for a while, but I will not.
And I kind of just wanted to open it up to the group. Is there anything, Dan, you briefly mentioned about, you're mostly digital. I mean, what are you seeing in the digital space, especially mentioning, like AI and that? What's going on in that space?
Well, we are seeing very high percentages of potential enrollments coming from fraudulent sources. And we do have some processes set up for detecting that, but our clients are in a constant battle as they implement different types of security, whether it's credit checks or other methods. But as soon as they put something in place, then there tends to be, countermeasures put in place by a lot of the fraudulent folks. So it's an ongoing battle at this time.
Yes,
One
and I
quick
can remember
comment.
go ahead, but I was just going
Sorry.
to say, I remember the day when they used to be, okay, we're having a tough time with telemarketing and that, so let's go on to the safe side of, online enrollments and digital, but it sounds like there's problems in that area as well.
Yeah, and one thing that Terry brought it up in terms of checking switch history. That's one thing that we've been working on is when somebody tries here in Texas, when somebody comes in, we can go back and check the Easy ID history of switches. If it's an Easy ID that has switched many times over the last 6 months, multiple times, then we put that Easy ID on a caution list or a red list. So that's one way that we're looking at, but we're always looking for other ways as well.
And Holly, you were going to say something?
I did. I just had a quick comment with regard to digital. There are a lot of tech companies out there, but there are some that do a really great job with some what I call power scripts or APIs that look to mitigate fraud and do it very, very well. So I just wanted to make that comment. There are services out there. So that would be kind of foundational in my mind to help mitigate what we know. There's a lot of human fraud, bot fraud from those web enrollment forms.
Okay, well, I think we'll probably move on to the next slide because moving right along.
Madeline, someone sent me an email separately.
Okay, that's fine.
And they had to drop, but they wanted to get this question out there. And it was around identifying fraud. So once you've identified it, that's great. But in Texas, there are a lot of restrictive rules that don't allow, I guess, reps to take any action immediately. So what are the steps that one should take with those?
Great question, and I actually saw that one, was going to save it for kind of our wrap up because that also is the subject, I think, of a whole nother webinar. I mean, there is a lot, but you're correct. In Texas, there are some restrictions, and short of the rules in place right now of having to do a notice when you see the fraudulent enrollment, just doesn't really fit our situation, and probably the rules probably weren't put in place for that particular thing. And so probably in all states there will be a need for new laws and new rules that allow companies to respond in a timely way. You hate to, that they were enrolled, and the customer didn't want to, and yet you can't do anything. You've got to send out a notice. You got to wait. That's not good for the customer. It's certainly not good for the company. So I think that and that's why we really do want some folks' input on, some of those kind of things.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question, Kelly. Now, as it's clear as we began to dig deeper into the topic of fraudulent enrollments and just fraud in general, it became apparent that we needed a more coordinated way to address this growing threat. We have recently formed, as I alluded to earlier, the Retail Energy Market, or REM Fraud Coalition. The REM Fraud Coalition definitely grew out. As Kelly said, we started just at a conference, and just that's all we heard about was fraud. And we said, well, we'll look into it. We'll examine it a bit further and better understand and identify existing available tools and perhaps other potential solutions that we need to help us keep on top of this growing threat. The REM Fraud Coalition really is an industry-wide evaluation to better understand and identify available tools. It's important because the coalition work, we want it to help find committed individuals and companies and organizations that will help us fight this effort. We welcome participation from industry entities, including suppliers, brokers, vendors, regulatory agencies, and consumer groups working within the energy space. We strongly believe by educating ourselves on the evolving threat of fraud and working together, we can achieve more effective and efficient outcomes. Drawing upon our pooled resources, we can better identify and stop fraud on a broader scale than any entity can do acting alone. So, this really is an introduction to our coalition as we wrap up this meeting. As a newly formed coalition, we are in the early phases of establishing ground rules. If you're interested in participating and learning more about the coalition, please let us know. We will provide more details about the coalition and suggested webinar topics and the ways participants may participate. We're definitely looking for your feedback. We're looking for proposed next topics. I think the one that was asked about, our current laws and regulations suited for meeting and combating fraud. And another really difficult for all of us is it's ever changing. I mean, we find tools and develop tools and measures to combat it, but then we see things changing on us. So we are looking for feedback as to what future topics you would like to see. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, we would certainly encourage you to do that, either through email to us, or we have the question still open. So if there's a question, any of our panelists have some questions or other thoughts on the topics.
Yeah, Madeline, let me jump in for a quick second. This is Trish Delise with Regulatory Compliance Services. I think what I would say is, certainly on the call today, we have some commission staffers from the Texas Commission, and that notion of fraudsters are always one step ahead. Regulations, everybody who's been in this space, regulations lag fraudsters by a mile. So, even having regulators as part of a coalition is helpful because it helps them understand the evolving nature of the fraud so that they can start thinking, is there a regulatory fix or is there more of an industry fix that's required? So, thanks for the commission staff taking some time to hear what some of the issues are, because they may be part of a solution. They may not be the entirety of a solution, but at some point, it may come down to tightening up regulations or envisioning a different kind of regulation. So very helpful.
Yes, and I thank
Yeah, I'd
you.
echo. Go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, that's great because I mean, the commission too is also in some ways on the front line. They're seeing things we're not seeing. They're, so, their input is going to be absolutely invaluable to this, or they may have seen, other solutions. So we really appreciate their willingness to participate. We have some other commissions that have reached out and said, we're absolutely interested in participating, want to understand more, because I think it really is all of us becoming more educated on the topic.
Yeah, and I would say as far as, with regulations are concerned, this happens in a lot of different places. Regulations have an intent, and they should be the minimum of what you are doing to prevent. It should not be, you shouldn't be curtailing your processes to just meet the minimum. This is why the U.S. doesn't really regulate a lot around like cybersecurity, is because they want the industry to be creative instead of prescriptive. And so the problem is if we do nothing, if we allow this to continue on, then regulatory will set regulations, and then there are always unintended consequences to the regulations, and it takes forever to implement them. So, it's kind of that almost like self-policing. But if we would use that as the baseline, here's what we have to prevent, and all work on it together, then I know that sounds like a kumbaya kind of thing, but we do need to work on this together. Otherwise, we will be forced to do something that will make it very difficult for us to do business and provide what we're trying to provide, which is a good product at a fair price to a customer. At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. So.
Right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I certainly, here's a page to resources, and I definitely want to thank all of our speakers providing, time and input. I'd also like to give a shout out to Tony Frenzel at Earth Etch, who volunteered to kind of spearhead all of the slides and putting it all together. But a lot of people behind the scenes helped with this, and appreciate also several companies have provided fabulous quotes, which we'll probably use in future websites. We just grabbed some with certain topics, but really encourage folks to let us know any of your thoughts, if your interest in participating, and particularly what you think you would like to see as next topics. We don't own this. We certainly want and need your input. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for attending and everybody who helped put this first webinar together. And given the number of people that are on this call right now and stayed on it throughout, I think we have hit upon an important topic. And let's all try to do something about it to make the industry better. All right. Well, thank you,
Thanks.
everybody. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.